50 degrees Celsius, 122 degrees Fahrenheit. How much can a human body endure inside a steel box under the African sun? The answer is 50 degrees. This is the point where proteins begin to denature. A sauna averages 70 degrees, but you stay there for 15 minutes. Panzer crews lived in it for weeks. Imagine the hatch. A loader cracks an egg against the turret's edge. The shell shatters. The yolk hits the metal and hisses. The clear liquid turns white instantly. They were literally baking breakfast on their own armor. The air inside was a thick soup. It smelled of 5 unwashed men, spent cordite, and scorched diesel. Bare skin could not touch the walls. Every handle, every shell casing, every bolt head was a branding iron. They fought from a furnace. In February 1943, at Kasserine Pass, these crews met the Americans. 20 M3 Grants and early Shermans became burning hulks. The German L-48 guns punched through frontal plates at over 1,000 meters. The Shermans had to crawl within 500 meters just to stand a chance. But the desert was a more disciplined killer than the enemy. Sand found its way into every seal. It mixed with lubricant oil. Fine dust turned heavy grease into a coarse grinding paste that chewed through tank tracks. 75% of all Panzer IV losses happened on one front, the East. It was a graveyard of steel and sanity. Those who survived the Sahara's heat soon realized they had merely traded a furnace for a freezer. Mass waves of Soviet armor charged through the fog. The numbers seemed infinite. Combat happened at point-blank range. Steel crushed steel. It didn't just destroy the tanks, it broke the men inside. Then came the cold, minus 40 degrees Celsius. At this temperature, physics changes. Transmission fluid turns into thick, useless sludge. Moving the tank required an hour of work with a roaring blowtorch just to thin the oil. The Maybach engines died in the frost. Starters clicked and failed. Crews had no choice but to light small fires directly under the engine blocks. Then, they reached for the inertia lever. One man gripped the handle and began the long, rhythmic grind of the hand crank. The rhythmic grind of the hand crank was a sound that echoed from the deserts of Libya to the gates of Moscow. Those who survived the African heat and the Russian frost knew one machine better than their own homes: the Panzer IV. It was the only German tank to remain in continuous production from the first day of the war to the last. This was the Reich's true workhorse. It was also a steel trap. For thousands of young men, this hull became either a forge for veterans or a crematorium. Why did this specific machine become a tomb for so many? It was the only working horse the Wehrmacht could rely on. The story began in January 1934. Germany was still shackled by the Treaty of Versailles. Military planners operated in shadows. They issued requirements for a medium tractor. It was a transparent lie. They wanted a medium tank. Under the new Blitzkrieg doctrine, every vehicle had a rigid role. The Panzer I and II would suppress infantry. The Panzer III, armed with a 37mm gun, would hunt enemy tanks. But they needed a heavy hitter for support. They called it the accompanying vehicle. Its purpose was raw firepower. To achieve this, the engineers fitted the chassis with a short-barreled 75mm gun. The short 75mm gun was ready, but the machine was only half of the equation. To drive a Panzer IV for 72 hours without a break, discipline was not enough. September 1, 1939, the invasion of Poland began. The Wehrmacht deployed 2,700 tanks. Only 211 of them were Panzer IVs. They acted as the steel tip of the spear. Command distributed them sparingly, 20 to 30 tanks per division. How does a human stay combat ready for 3 days straight? The answer was biochemistry. Pervitin. The driver stares through the narrow slit. His eyes are wide. They do not blink. His grip on the steering levers is skeletal. Behind him, the loader moves with mechanical precision. There is no fatigue, only a cold, artificial clarity. Pervitin was the commercial name for methamphetamine. Today, the world bans this substance as a hard drug. In 1939, the Temmler factory produced it by the millions. The quartermaster opens a cardboard box. He pulls out a blister pack of 10 pills. He hands them to the commander. The crew swallows the tablets without water. The war did not stop for sleep. The Army High Command issued millions of doses to the frontline crews. The narcotic haze of 1939 vanished against the reality of steel. Methamphetamine fueled the initial rush, but it could not pierce armor. At the village of Stone, German crews faced the French Char B-1. It was a monster. The short 75mm howitzer fired, a direct hit. The shell screamed as it ricocheted off the thick French plates. The German gun was useless. Was this a temporary setback or a systemic failure? Panzer IV crews watched their rounds shatter like glass. They were safe only as long as they didn't meet a real tank. This vulnerability would soon turn into a nightmare on a global scale. A year later, on the road to Moscow, these same men would encounter the T-34. It was the same shock, but 10 times deadlier. The myth of invincibility was dying in the mud. The High Command saw the gap. They needed numbers. Factories shifted gears, eventually churning out over 8,500 Panzer IVs of all variants. But the tank was no longer the king of the production line. It was surpassed by the assault gun, which saw a massive run of 10,000 units. Engineers designed a tank for fire support, not a fortress. The blueprints prioritized the short-barreled 75mm gun. It looked like a howitzer. It hit like one. But the steel skin around it was a compromise. Early industrial limits dictated the shape. German designers wanted perfection. The military needed numbers. They chose a practical, simplified path. This was the Model A. Safety was traded for speed. The frontal armor measured only 15 millimeters. A heavy machine gun could tear through it at close range. Instead of complex torsion bars, they used a basic leaf spring suspension. It was crude. It was outdated. But the factories could build it now. The crew sat behind thin plates, knowing the math was against them. Technical superiority remained a dream on paper. In reality, they headed to the front in a stopgap. Only 35 units of the initial Model A ever left the assembly line. 15 millimeters of armor became a death sentence when the Wehrmacht crossed the Soviet border. High Command expected a repeat of the French collapse. For the first few weeks, the maps looked perfect. Then the reports changed. The crews saw a silhouette through the TZF-5F sights. It was a T-34. The gunner adjusted the flywheel and fired. A direct hit. The steel slug struck the sloped armor and skidded off into the sky. Inside the Panzer, the commander's voice cracked over the intercom. They fired again. Another ricochet. Then the Soviet tank turned its turret. What do you do when your shell simply bounces off the enemy? You call for the flak units and their 88mm anti-aircraft cannons. They were the only weapons capable of cracking the Soviet hulls in 1941. The technical superiority was absolute. The Soviet 76mm high-velocity guns pierced Panzer IVs from distances where German crews couldn't even aim. A dull metallic thud against the hull meant the end. The Panzer IV was no longer a hunter, it was a target. Panic reached the chancellery. Hitler read the frontline reports and realized the Blitzkrieg had hit a wall of steel. The KV-1 and T-34 were monsters compared to his support tanks. He demanded an immediate response. The industry scrambled to adapt. As a first step, the High Command ordered the modernization of the Panzer III, upgunning it from a 37 to a 50mm cannon. The upgrade of the Panzer III proved to be a dead end. Its turret ring was too small. No matter the engineering, it could not fit a weapon larger than 50mm. The Panzer IV became the only hope for survival. Its turret ring was 12 inches wider. This gap changed everything. Hitler ordered a high-velocity 75mm gun for the chassis. The result was the F2 variant. It carried a modified version of the famous Pak-40. Contrast the roles. The Panzer IV began the war as a support vehicle, firing low-velocity howitzer shells at infantry. Now it was a dedicated tank hunter. It could penetrate 77mm of armor from 1,800 meters away. But a machine is only as good as its crew. These men were trained for artillery support. Suddenly, they were thrust into the role of a main battle tank. The long barrel changed the physics of the fight. The extra weight shifted the balance. Precision increased, but the turret turned slower. Maneuverability in tight spaces vanished. The crews felt a grim sense of relief. They finally had a fighting chance against Soviet behemoths like the KV-1. But this power came with a price. They were no longer supporting the front. They were the target. By the time the F-2 reached the front, the next generation was already in development. The Panther appeared as a direct competitor. While factory lines struggled to master the Panther, the veterans in the Panzer IV faced a brutal reality. The new Wunderwaffe was a disaster of rushed engineering. At the Battle of Kursk, the Panther's engines ignited and transmissions shredded before they even reached the front. The old reliable Mark IV had to carry the war alone. But the machine was reaching its physical limit. To survive, it became a patchwork of steel. Engineers bolted a 30mm armor plate directly onto the original 50mm hull. It was a crude, heavy fix. Did these thin iron sheets actually save lives? Against the Soviet anti-tank rifles, the answer was yes. Against a tank, it was a gamble. The most visible change was the Scherzen. These distinctive metal skirts hung along the hull and turret like a loose coat. They were designed to catch bullets and pre-detonate shaped charges from American bazookas. The crews hated them. The skirts were flimsy. A driver would push through dense brush, and the sound of screeching metal would fill the cabin. Branches ripped the plates from their mounts. A tank would enter the woods looking like a fortress and emerge half naked, its protection left behind in the dirt. Despite the flaws, the Panzer IV was evolving into a predator. By late 1942, the upgraded frontal armor could finally deflect 75mm shells from an American Sherman at medium range. In North Africa, British tankers encountered the new F-2 and G variants with dread. They called them the Panzer Specials. At the Kasserine Pass, the Americans learned the same lesson. The thin metal plates of the Scherzen successfully detonated incoming heat rounds before they could touch the main hull. The steel plates in Scherzen offered a temporary sense of security, but in the desert, the real killer was invisible. It was the dust. Fine African sand turned engine grease into grinding paste. Machine guns jammed. Rubber tank tracks disintegrated. In the open desert, a seized engine was a death sentence. To break down meant capture or a slow death under the sun. Crews fought for every mile, improvising repairs with whatever they had. By early 1943, the situation turned critical. The Afrika Korps was cornered in Tunisia. Allied forces squeezed the perimeter. Supplies stopped. Fuel ran dry. The Mediterranean became a graveyard for German transport ships. Retreat was no longer an option. When the end became inevitable, the final order arrived. Destroy the machines. Do not leave a single panzer for the Allies. One veteran described the ritual of mechanical suicide. The crew opened the fuel caps. They poured buckets of sand directly into the tanks. They started the engine and listened. The pistons screamed as the grit tore the cylinders apart. Then the engine seized. Next came the gun. They jammed heavy rocks into the muzzle, packing them tight. They loaded a high-explosive shell into the breech. A long string was tied to the trigger. The crew moved back, took cover, and pulled. The barrel peeled open like a rotted fruit. The breech shattered. What was once a mobile fortress became a heap of smoking, twisted scrap. They walked away from the wreckage on foot. Behind them, the pride of the Panzerwaffe was reduced to useless metal. Yet for those who survived Tunisia, Africa was not the nightmare. Ask any veteran about their worst posting. They will not talk about the heat or the sand. They will point east. The crew of the last Panzer IV in the sector surrendered their positions and headed for the prisoner of war camps.